The morning sun cast long shadows across Naval Amphibious Base Coronado as Commander Jake Morrison approached the main security checkpoint. It was just another Tuesday in September, or so he thought. The sea breeze carried the familiar scent of salt and diesel fuel from the harbor, mixing with the crisp autumn air that reminded him why he loved serving on the West Coast. Morrison had been a Navy SEAL for 15 years, with 3 combat deployments and countless classified missions under his belt. He commanded Alpha Team, one of the most elite units in SEAL Team 5. His men respected him not just for his tactical brilliance, but for his ability to read people and situations with uncanny accuracy. That morning, however, something was about to challenge everything he thought he knew about reading people. As he pulled up to the checkpoint in his black Ford pickup, Morrison noticed an unusual commotion near the visitor processing center. A small crowd of Marines and sailors had gathered around what appeared to be an elderly woman. She looked to be in her 70s, with silver hair neatly pulled back and wearing a simple navy blue dress that had seen better days. Her posture was remarkably straight for someone her age, and despite the crowd around her, she maintained an air of quiet dignity. The woman carried a worn leather briefcase and seemed to be having some sort of discussion with the duty officer. From his truck, Morrison could see the confusion on the young Marine's face as he gestured toward his computer screen and then back at the woman. Other personnel had stopped their morning routines to watch the unusual scene unfold. Morrison parked his truck and walked toward the group, his curiosity getting the better of him. As he got closer, he could hear fragments of the conversation. The duty officer, a young corporal who looked fresh out of boot camp, was clearly frustrated. "Ma'am, I understand what you're telling me, but I don't have any record of your clearance in the system," the corporal was saying, his voice strained with the effort of remaining respectful while following protocol. "Without proper documentation, I cannot allow access to the base." The elderly woman remained calm, her voice steady and patient. "Son, I understand your position, but I assure you that my clearance is valid. Perhaps you could contact your commanding officer." Morrison noticed something in her tone that made him pause. There was an authority there, subtle but unmistakable. It wasn't the demanding voice of someone used to getting their way through entitlement. Instead, it carried the quiet confidence of someone who had earned respect through years of service and sacrifice. "Ma'am, with all due respect," the corporal continued, "I've checked 3 times. There's no record of you in our visitor database, and your name doesn't appear in any of our authorized personnel lists. I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises." The woman nodded slowly, as if she had expected this response. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a manila folder thick with documents. "Young man, I've been coming to military bases longer than you've been alive. I know the protocols and I know my rights. I have business here today that cannot wait." Morrison found himself stepping forward, though he wasn't sure why. Something about the woman commanded his attention in a way he couldn't explain. As he approached, she turned to look at him, and their eyes met. What he saw there made him stop in his tracks. Her eyes were steel gray, sharp and intelligent, but it was something deeper that caught his attention. They held the weight of experience, of secrets kept, and burdens carried. Morrison had seen similar eyes before, in the faces of his fellow operators after difficult missions, in the reflection of his own mirror after particularly challenging deployments. "Is there a problem here?" Morrison asked, his voice carrying the natural authority of his rank. The corporal immediately straightened. "Sir, this woman is requesting base access, but she has no record in our system. I've followed all protocols, but she insists she has legitimate business here." Morrison turned his attention to the woman who was studying him with the same intensity he was studying her. "Ma'am, I'm Commander Morrison. Perhaps I can help clarify the situation?" The woman extended her hand, and Morrison was surprised by the firmness of her grip. "Commander, I appreciate your offer to help. My name is Eleanor Hartwell, and I have an appointment with Admiral Richardson at 900 hours. Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly. Admiral Richardson was the base commander, a man notoriously difficult to get time with, even for senior officers. The fact that this elderly civilian claimed to have a meeting with him was unusual, to say the least. "Ma'am, Admiral Richardson's schedule is typically coordinated through multiple channels. Are you certain about this appointment?" Eleanor opened her briefcase again and retrieved a letter on official Navy letterhead. The document was authentic, bearing the Admiral's signature and requesting her presence for a matter of significant historical importance. Morrison examined the letter carefully, noting the official seals and proper formatting. "This appears legitimate," Morrison said, handing the letter back. "Corporal, have you tried contacting the Admiral's office directly?" The young Marine's face reddened slightly. "No, sir. I was following standard visitor processing procedures." Morrison understood the corporal's position. Young enlisted personnel were taught to follow protocols exactly, and deviating from procedure could result in serious consequences. However, he also recognized that some situations required flexibility and judgment. "Ma'am, while we sort this out, would you mind if I asked what brings you to see the Admiral? It might help us expedite the process." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her gaze moving from Morrison to the gathered crowd of onlookers, then back to him. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but every word carried weight. "Commander, I'm here to return something that belongs to the Navy, something that should have been returned a very long time ago." The mystery deepened, and Morrison found himself more intrigued than ever. As he looked at Eleanor Hartwell standing there with her worn briefcase and quiet dignity, he had no idea that his life was about to intersect with a story that would challenge everything he thought he knew about courage, sacrifice, and the true meaning of service. After 20 minutes of phone calls and verification procedures, the corporal finally received clearance to escort Eleanor Hartwell to Admiral Richardson's office. Commander Morrison, his curiosity now fully engaged, requested permission to accompany them. Something about the elderly woman's presence had stirred a feeling he couldn't shake, and his instincts told him this was more than a routine meeting. The walk across the base took them past the iconic SEAL training facilities, where Morrison could hear the sounds of his brothers-in-arms conducting morning PT. Eleanor moved with surprising grace for her age, keeping pace without difficulty and observing everything around her with keen interest. She paused momentarily when they passed the memorial wall, reading the names of fallen SEALs with what appeared to be deep reverence. "Did you know any of them?" Morrison asked quietly. Eleanor's fingers traced the air near one of the names, as if touching an invisible memorial. "In a way, Commander, I knew them all." Before Morrison could ask what she meant, they arrived at the Admiral's headquarters building. The corporal led them through security and up to the second floor, where Admiral Richardson's office occupied, a corner suite with windows overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Admiral Richardson was an imposing figure, even at 62 years old. His silver hair was cut in a precise military style, and his uniform bore the ribbons of a distinguished career spanning 4 decades. When Eleanor entered his office, however, something remarkable happened. The Admiral, who was known for his formal demeanor and strict adherence to military protocol, immediately stood and moved around his desk with an expression of genuine warmth. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, extending both hands to clasp hers, "thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would." Eleanor smiled, the first genuine smile Morrison had seen from her that morning. "Admiral, when the Navy calls, old habits die hard." Morrison remained near the door, uncertain whether he should leave, but Admiral Richardson gestured for him to take a seat. "Commander Morrison, I'm glad you're here. What I'm about to share with you is not classified, but it has been kept quiet for many years." Mrs. Hartwell's story is one that every naval officer should know. The Admiral returned to his desk and opened a thick manila folder. Inside were dozens of photographs, documents, and what appeared to be official correspondence dating back several decades. He selected a black and white photograph and handed it to Morrison. The image showed a young woman in her 20s wearing what appeared to be civilian clothes but standing next to a military jeep. Her face was partially obscured by shadows, but Morrison could see the strong jawline and determined expression. Behind her, several men in military uniforms were visible, though their faces had been deliberately obscured. "Commander, meet Eleanor Hartwell, circa 1968, the Admiral said. Though that wasn't her name then. Morrison studied the photograph more closely, then looked up at Eleanor. The bone structure was the same, and those steel-gray eyes were unmistakable even 50 years later. Mrs. Hartwell served in Vietnam, Admiral Richardson continued, but not in any capacity that appears in official records. She was part of a program so classified that it took me 3 months and a direct order from the Secretary of the Navy to access her file. Eleanor shifted in her chair, her hands folded in her lap. Admiral, you're being too generous. I was simply in the right place at the right time, or perhaps the wrong place, depending on how you look at it. Ma'am, with respect, that's not how the after-action reports describe it, the Admiral replied firmly. He turned to Morrison. Commander, in 1968, Mrs. Hartwell was working as a civilian contractor for the Defense Intelligence Agency. Her cover was that of a freelance journalist, which gave her access to areas and personnel that military operatives couldn't reach. Morrison leaned forward, intrigued. What kind of operations, sir? The Admiral selected another document from the folder. Reconnaissance missions behind enemy lines, intelligence gathering, and in at least 3 documented cases, direct action missions that saved the lives of American servicemen. Eleanor spoke quietly. I had certain language skills that proved useful. I could move through Vietnamese communities without attracting the same attention as American military personnel. Sometimes that meant gathering information. Sometimes it meant more direct action. More direct action? Morrison asked. Admiral Richardson answered. Mrs. Hartwell personally extracted 4 Navy pilots from behind enemy lines. She coordinated with local resistance fighters to sabotage enemy supply lines. And on one occasion, she single-handedly held off a North Vietnamese patrol, long enough for a wounded SEAL team to reach their extraction point. Morrison stared at Eleanor with new respect. The elderly woman sitting across from him had been conducting operations that would challenge even today's most elite warriors. Ma'am, why isn't this in the official records? Because officially I was never there, Eleanor replied. The program I worked for didn't exist. The missions I conducted never happened. When the war ended, everyone involved simply went back to their regular lives and never spoke about what we had done. The Admiral pulled out one final document, this one bearing multiple official seals. Commander, this is why Mrs. Hartwell is here today. 3 weeks ago, while cleaning out her late husband's belongings, she discovered something that officially belongs to the United States Navy. Eleanor reached into her briefcase and withdrew a small wooden box, no larger than a jewelry case. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed it on the Admiral's desk. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was a Navy cross. This belonged to Lieutenant James Patterson, she said softly. He was killed during the extraction of a downed pilot in 1969. I was with him when he died, and somehow, in all the chaos of that night, his medal ended up in my possession. I've carried the guilt of that for 54 years. Morrison felt a chill run down his spine. The Navy Cross was the second highest military decoration for valor, awarded only for extraordinary heroism in combat. The idea that one had been missing from official records for over half a century was almost unthinkable. Admiral Richardson carefully lifted the medal from its box, examining the engraving on the back. Lieutenant Patterson's family was told his medal was lost in action. His mother died believing her son's sacrifice had been forgotten. Eleanor's composure finally cracked and tears began to flow down her cheeks. I should have returned it years ago. I kept telling myself I would, but then years turned into decades, and it became easier to pretend it wasn't there. When my husband passed last month, I found it among his things. He had been protecting me from my own guilt all these years. Morrison understood now why Admiral Richardson had called this meeting. This wasn't just about returning a medal. It was about finally acknowledging sacrifices that had been hidden in shadow for over 50 years, about giving honor to those who had served without recognition or thanks. The Admiral stood and moved to the window, looking out at the ocean where so many naval operations had begun and ended. Mrs. Hartwell, the Navy owes you a debt that can never be fully repaid. Your service may not appear in official records, but it will not be forgotten. Eleanor wiped her eyes and straightened in her chair, her dignity returning. Admiral, I didn't do it for recognition. None of us did. We did it because it was right, because American boys were dying, and we had skills that could help bring them home. Morrison found himself deeply moved by the woman's quiet courage, both during the war and now, in facing the guilt she had carried for so many years. As he looked at her, he began to understand that heroism came in many forms, and that some of the greatest heroes never wore uniforms or received medals. The meeting was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would reveal even more about Eleanor Hartwell's extraordinary past. Admiral Richardson returned to his desk and pulled out a red folder marked with multiple classification stamps. His expression grew more serious as he opened it, revealing documents that had been sealed for decades. Mrs. Hartwell, what I'm about to show you has been classified at the highest level since 1970. The Secretary of Defense personally authorized its declassification for this meeting. He handed her a typed report, yellowed with age. This is the after-action report from Operation Nightingale, filed by Commander William Hayes of SEAL Team 2. Eleanor's hands shook as she took the document. Morrison could see her eyes moving across the pages, reading details of missions she had lived through but never seen documented. Her face grew pale as she absorbed the official account of events she remembered all too well. "I never knew they wrote reports about what we did," she whispered. The Admiral nodded gravely. Commander Hayes was ordered to document every operation involving civilian assets. These reports were so sensitive that only 3 copies were ever made. One went to the CIA, one to the Secretary of Defense, and one remained in Naval Intelligence files. Morrison leaned forward. "Sir, what exactly did these operations involve?" Admiral Richardson selected a photograph from the file and placed it on the desk. The image showed Eleanor, much younger, standing with a group of men in military gear. Unlike the previous photo, this one clearly showed the faces of the servicemen around her. This photograph was taken after Operation Nightingale's most successful mission, the Admiral explained. Mrs. Hartwell had been tracking a North Vietnamese colonel who was coordinating attacks on American fire bases. The intelligence she gathered allowed SEAL Team 2 to neutralize the entire command structure. Eleanor looked up from the report, her eyes meeting Morrison's. "Commander, what the Admiral isn't telling you is that I wasn't just gathering intelligence on that mission. I was the one who identified the target's location, planned the infiltration route, and provided real-time tactical support during the assault." Morrison felt his understanding of the elderly woman shift once again. "Ma'am, you were essentially operating as a Special Forces operative?" The technical term was Deep Cover Intelligence Asset, Admiral Richardson said. "But in practical terms, yes. Mrs. Hartwell was conducting missions that would today require years of specialized training and psychological evaluation." Eleanor set the report aside and looked directly at Morrison. "Commander, I need you to understand something. I wasn't trained for this work. I was a linguistics major from Stanford University who happened to be fluent in Vietnamese and French. When the DIA recruited me, they gave me 3 weeks of basic survival training and sent me into the field." The Admiral pulled out another document, this one bearing the seal of the Central Intelligence Agency. "This is a psychological evaluation conducted after Mrs. Hartwell's return from Vietnam. The psychologist noted that despite having no formal military training, she demonstrated tactical thinking and decision-making abilities that surpassed many career officers." Morrison studied the evaluation, noting the clinical language used to describe Eleanor's mental state and capabilities. The psychologist had written extensively about her ability to compartmentalize traumatic experiences and maintain operational effectiveness under extreme stress. "Mrs. Hartwell," Morrison said carefully, "how many missions were you involved in?" Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on her hands. "Officially, none. Unofficially, I was in country for 18 months. During that time, I participated in 37 operations of various types. 12 of those involved direct combat." The number stunned Morrison. Even experienced SEALs rarely participated in that many combat operations in such a short time frame. For a civilian with minimal training, it was almost unbelievable. Admiral Richardson opened to another section of the file. "Commander, here's something that might interest you. Several of the SEALs who worked with Mrs. Hartwell went on to become senior leaders in the special operations community. 3 of them specifically recommended her for military honors. He handed Morrison a letter written on official Navy letterhead. The signature at the bottom belonged to Admiral Robert Chen, who had served as commander of Naval Special Warfare Command in the 1980s. In the letter, then Lieutenant Chen described Eleanor as the most effective intelligence operative I worked with in Vietnam and recommended her for the Navy Distinguished Service Medal. Admiral Chen wrote this letter in 1971, Richardson explained. It was denied because officially Mrs. Hartwell's service didn't exist. The operations she participated in were classified at levels that prevented any public recognition. Eleanor reached for the letter, reading it with obvious emotion. Bobby Chen, she said softly. He was just a kid then, barely older than the men he was leading. I heard he made admiral. Good for him. Morrison realized he was witnessing something extraordinary. Not only was Eleanor Hartwell a forgotten hero of the Vietnam War, but she had worked alongside men who had gone on to shape modern naval special warfare. Her influence on American military operations had rippled through decades, even though her name appeared in no official histories. Ma'am, Morrison said, why are you coming forward with this now? You could have returned Lieutenant Patterson's medal quietly without revealing your own service record. Eleanor smiled sadly. Commander, I'm 76 years old. My husband died last month and I have no children. When I'm gone, the only record of what those brave men did in Vietnam will be these classified files that no one will ever see. Lieutenant, Patterson deserves better than that. They all do. The Admiral closed the red folder and looked directly at Morrison. Commander, this is why I asked you to stay for this meeting. Mrs. Hartwell's service record is being partially declassified. Selected operations will be added to the official historical record with her permission. The men she served with, including Lieutenant Patterson, will finally receive proper recognition for their sacrifices. Morrison felt the weight of what he was hearing. Military history was being rewritten before his eyes, and forgotten heroes were finally getting their due recognition. But there was still one question that nagged at him. Mrs. Hartwell, you mentioned that Lieutenant Patterson's medal ended up in your possession during the chaos of that night. Can you tell us what happened? Eleanor's expression darkened, and, for the first time since Morrison had met her, she looked every one of her 76 years. The Admiral noticed her discomfort and started to speak, but she held up her hand. No, Admiral. Commander Morrison has been patient and respectful. He deserves to know the truth. She took a deep breath and continued. The night Lieutenant Patterson died was the night I learned that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what needs to be done despite being terrified. Morrison sensed that they were about to hear the most important part of Eleanor Hartwell's story, the event that had shaped everything that followed. As he prepared to listen, he had no idea that her account would challenge his own understanding of what it meant to be a warrior. Eleanor stared out the window for a long moment, gathering her thoughts. When she began speaking, her voice carried the weight of memories that had been buried for over 50 years. It was March 15, 1969, she began. We had been tracking a high-value target for 3 weeks. Intelligence indicated that a North Vietnamese general was meeting with local commanders to plan a major offensive against American positions. The meeting was supposed to take place in a village about 30 kilometers northwest of Da Nang. Admiral Richardson and Morrison listened intently as Eleanor described the mission planning. She had been tasked with infiltrating the village beforehand to confirm the target's presence and provide real-time intelligence to the SEAL team that would conduct the assault. Lieutenant Patterson's team was supposed to insert 2 kilometers away and wait for my signal, Eleanor continued. The plan was simple. I would confirm the target, provide coordinates, and withdraw to a safe distance while the SEALs conducted their operation. Morrison could already sense where this story was heading. In his experience, simple plans rarely survived contact with the enemy. What went wrong? He asked quietly. Eleanor's hands gripped the arms of her chair. Everything. The intelligence was wrong. Instead of a small meeting with local commanders, there were over 200 North Vietnamese soldiers in that village. They weren't planning an offensive. They were already positioned for one that was supposed to begin at dawn. She described how she had arrived at the village just after sunset, posing as a local woman seeking shelter for the night. Within minutes of her arrival, she realized the scope of the enemy presence. The village was heavily fortified, with machine, gun positions and mortar teams that hadn't appeared in any intelligence reports. I tried to radio Lieutenant Patterson to abort the mission, but my communications equipment had been damaged during the infiltration. I was on my own, with no way to warn the SEAL team that they were walking into a trap. Admiral Richardson leaned forward. "Mrs. Hartwell, the after-action report indicates that you managed to warn the team somehow. How did you do it?" Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. "I had two choices. I could try to escape and save myself, knowing that Lieutenant Patterson and his men would be massacred when they arrived, or I could create enough chaos to disrupt the enemy's preparations and give the SEALs a fighting chance." Morrison felt, his admiration for the elderly woman growing. As a SEAL commander, he understood the weight of such decisions and the courage required to choose the more dangerous path. "I decided to cause a distraction," Eleanor continued. "There was an ammunition depot on the eastern edge of the village, lightly guarded because the enemy felt secure in their numbers. If I could destroy it, the explosion would alert Lieutenant Patterson's team and possibly create enough confusion for them to escape." She described her approach to the ammunition depot, moving through shadows and avoiding patrols with skills she had learned through trial and error during previous missions. The depot was guarded by 2 soldiers, both of whom she managed to neutralize silently using techniques that would have impressed experienced Special Forces operators. I had brought C4 explosives with me, standard equipment for intelligence operatives working behind enemy lines. I placed the charges and set a timer for 10 minutes, which I calculated would give me enough time to reach the extraction point and warn Lieutenant Patterson's team. Morrison could visualize the scene. A young civilian woman, alone in enemy territory, executing a demolition mission that would challenge even experienced combat engineers. "The explosion was bigger than I expected," Eleanor said, her voice growing quieter. "The ammunition depot contained more ordnance than intelligence had indicated. The blast destroyed half the village and killed dozens of enemy soldiers, but it also attracted every remaining fighter in the area." She described her desperate flight through the jungle, pursued by North Vietnamese soldiers who were determined to capture the saboteur responsible for the destruction. Her route took her directly toward the location where Lieutenant Patterson's SEAL team was waiting. I reached their position just as the pursuit caught up with me. Lieutenant Patterson and his men were pinned down by enemy fire, but they refused to leave me behind. They could have escaped into the jungle, but they chose to make a stand. Morrison recognized the loyalty and brotherhood that characterized special operations units. SEALs never left a teammate behind, and they had clearly considered Eleanor part of their team. "The firefight lasted for over 2 hours," Eleanor continued. "We were outnumbered at least 10-1, but Lieutenant Patterson's men were incredibly skilled. They turned what should have been a massacre into a tactical nightmare for the enemy." She described the battle with remarkable clarity, recalling details about weapons, positioning, and tactics that demonstrated her deep understanding of military operations. Morrison realized that her 18 months in Vietnam had given her combat experience that rivaled many career soldiers. "Lieutenant, Patterson was hit during the final enemy assault," Eleanor said, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "The bullet caught him in the chest and I knew immediately that the wound was fatal. But he continued fighting, directing his men and calling in artillery support that saved all of our lives." Morrison felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same emotion he experienced whenever he heard stories of fallen warriors who had sacrificed themselves for their brothers. "In his final moments, Lieutenant Patterson gave me his Navy Cross. He said it belonged to someone who had earned it through courage under fire. I tried to refuse, but he insisted. He told me that what I had done that night, choosing to risk my life to save his team, was the definition of heroism." Eleanor reached into her purse and withdrew a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. She handed it to Morrison, who unfolded it carefully. Written in fading pencil were Lieutenant Patterson's final words, transcribed in Eleanor's handwriting. "For Eleanor, the bravest person I've ever known, You saved us all. J.P. Morrison read the note twice, feeling the weight of a dying man's gratitude and respect. He looked up at Eleanor, seeing her not as an elderly civilian but as a warrior who had earned her place among the most honored veterans. Admiral Richardson spoke quietly. Mrs. Hartwell, Lieutenant Patterson's family needs to hear this story. His sacrifice and yours deserves to be remembered. Eleanor nodded, wiping away her tears. Admiral, I've carried the guilt of surviving when better people died for 54 years. If sharing this story helps honor Lieutenant Patterson's memory, then I'm ready to tell it to the world. Morrison realized that he was witnessing something remarkable, a hero finally stepping out of the shadows to claim her rightful place in history. But there was still one more surprise waiting for him. As Eleanor finished her account of that fateful night in Vietnam, Admiral Richardson opened another section of the classified file. His expression grew thoughtful as he examined a particular document. Mrs. Hartwell, there's something else in your file that I think Commander Morrison should see. He pulled out a personnel roster from 1969, running his finger down a list of names until he found what he was looking for. Commander, what was your father's full name and service record? Morrison looked puzzled by the seemingly random question. Sir, my father was Chief Petty Officer Michael Morrison, Navy diver, served 2 tours in Vietnam. He died in a training accident when I was 12. Why do you ask? Admiral Richardson's expression grew more serious as he consulted the document. Commander, your father's name appears on several operations reports in Mrs. Hartwell's file. According to these records, CPO Morrison participated in at least 6 missions, where Mrs. Hartwell provided intelligence support. Morrison felt the room spinning slightly. His father had rarely spoken about his time in Vietnam, and Morrison had always assumed his reticence was typical of combat veterans who preferred not to relive difficult memories. Eleanor had gone completely, still, staring at Morrison with an expression of growing recognition. Slowly, she reached into her briefcase and withdrew an old photograph that Morrison hadn't seen before. The image showed a group of naval personnel standing beside a river, their diving equipment visible in the background. Commander, Eleanor said quietly, what did your father look like? Morrison pulled out his wallet and showed her a family photograph taken just before his father's death. Eleanor gasped, placing her hand over her heart. My God, she whispered, you're Mickey Morrison's son. The nickname hit Morrison like a physical blow. Only his father's closest friends and family had called him Mickey, and Morrison hadn't heard anyone use that name in over 20 years. You knew my father? Morrison asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears as she held up the old photograph. Commander, your father saved my life. Not once, but 3 separate times. He was the most skilled combat diver I ever worked with and one of the bravest men I've ever known. Admiral Richardson consulted the file again. According to these reports, CPO Morrison specialized in underwater demolition and river reconnaissance. He frequently worked with intelligence assets who needed insertion or extraction from areas accessible only by water. Eleanor nodded enthusiastically. Mickey was extraordinary. He could navigate rivers in complete darkness, place explosives with surgical precision, and extract personnel from impossible situations. During my time in Vietnam, he was responsible for getting me in and out of some of the most dangerous missions I undertook. Morrison stared at the photograph Eleanor had shown him. His father appeared younger than Morrison had ever seen him, but the same calm determination was evident in his expression. Standing next to him was Eleanor, looking barely out of her teens but carrying herself with the confidence of an experienced operative. Mrs. Hartwell, can you tell me about the missions you conducted with my father? Eleanor smiled through her tears. Your father never talked about his work, did he? That was typical of Mickey. He was the most professional sailor I ever met, but also the most humble. She described several operations where Chief Morrison had provided water-based support for her intelligence missions. His expertise had allowed her to access enemy positions along Vietnam's extensive river system, gathering crucial intelligence that saved countless American lives. There was one mission, in particular, Eleanor continued, where Mickey's skills made all the difference. I needed to place surveillance equipment near a major enemy supply depot located on the Mekong Delta. The only approach was through a network of canals heavily patrolled by enemy boats. Morrison leaned forward, hungry for details about his father's service that had never been shared with his family. Mickey spent 3 days studying the patrol patterns and water conditions. He designed an approach route that took us through seemingly impossible passages, timing our movement to avoid enemy detection. The mission was a complete success, and the intelligence we gathered disrupted enemy supply lines for months. Admiral Richardson found another document in the file. Mrs. Hartwell, there's a commendation here written by Lieutenant Colonel James Bradley, recommending CPO Morrison for the Silver Star. It specifically mentions his work with intelligence assets in high-risk environments. Morrison felt his chest tighten with pride and grief. His father had been recommended for one of the military's highest decorations, but Morrison had never known about it. What happened to the recommendation? Morrison asked. Same thing that happened to all recognition for our operations, Eleanor replied sadly. The missions were classified at levels that prevented any public acknowledgement. Your father's heroism was buried in files that weren't supposed to exist. Eleanor reached across and placed her hand on Morrison's arm. Commander, your father talked about you constantly. He was so proud of you, even when you were just a little boy. He used to carry pictures of you on every mission. Morrison's vision blurred with tears he hadn't expected. Learning about his father's classified service was overwhelming enough, but hearing about his love and pride from someone who had witnessed it firsthand was almost too much to bear.
He told me he hoped you would join the Navy someday, Eleanor continued. When I heard your name this morning, I wondered if there might be a connection, but I never imagined. Mickey would be so proud to know that his son became a SEAL commander. Admiral.
Richardson cleared his throat softly. Commander, there's one more thing. Mrs. Hartwell's file contains a personal statement written by your father after her extraction from Vietnam. Would you like to read it? Morrison nodded, not trusting his voice to speak. The Admiral handed him a typed report with his father's signature at the bottom. The document was brief but powerful, describing Eleanor as the most courageous individual I served with in Vietnam and recommending her for the highest civilian honors. His father had written, Mrs. Hartwell's dedication to the mission and willingness to sacrifice her own safety for the lives of American servicemen represents the finest traditions of service to our country. She has earned the respect and gratitude of every sailor and Marine she worked with. Morrison looked up at Eleanor, seeing her now not just as a war hero, but as someone who had shared experiences with his father that had shaped both of their lives. Mrs. Hartwell, Morrison said, his voice thick with emotion, thank you for sharing.